Hello, and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host, Union, and in this one we have additional developments across the Uskal River line, where the Russians have managed to advance further, expanding their bridgehead across the river line near the Kupiansk direction. The Russians have also managed to advance near the Zherebets river line, creating a new bridgehead across the river line and occupying parts of the settlement of Ivanivka on the western bank of the Zherebets Riverline. The Russians have also made several advances near the Pokrovsk section of the front line. Starting out in the south, we see that the Russians have managed to advance further to capture the complete farm area of Novovasilivka, getting 100% full control over the settlement, and fighting has not reached Uspennivka, the outskirts of the settlement. Fighting continues in the western outskirts of Solone, as the Russians continue moving along the Solone River towards the Dnipro region in that direction. The Russians have also managed to advance north of Vovkova, capturing additional forest lines, and fighting has now reached the highway between the city of Pokrovsk with the city of Zaporizhia. The Russians are fighting over the fortified positions north of Pyshane along the forest lines, and the road between Pyshane and Kotlina. To gain control of these fortified positions would allow the Russians to create a strong position from which they can storm Kotlina and secure the supply road in and out of Pokrovsk towards Zaporizhia. This will limit the supplies coming in and out from this road. Also allowed the Russians to push further along towards the Dnipro region, in between that of the highway to the north and the Solona River to the south, creating a buffer zone here in between Pokrovsk and the Zaporizhia road as they continue advancing along the border area. The objective of the Russians being to advance along the border section, bypassing Pokrovsk, cutting off the main roads, and advancing towards the fortified positions in the rear, cutting off the connection between Pokrovsk and additional supply roads. The Russians would be able to cut off the two roads on the left-hand side and the western side of the city, as well as the road on the eastern side, which would operationally encircle the city, but they could go a step further and cut off the intersection near Dobropilya, where they would be able to leave only one singular road in and out of the area, going through Toretsk, limiting the supply lines further by limiting it to this singular road in and out of the city, which would increase the effectiveness of the operational encirclement, but also spread the Ukrainian supplies out if they have to cover the city of Pokrovsk with the defense through an encirclement, and also expands the front line further. They would be limited in the amount of capabilities and capacity they can send to the city. Also realized the dangers that FPV drones pose to the siege of the city from both sides, and that is the Russians currently hold several settlements near the city of Pokrovsk, including Shevchenko, Novotroitsk, Novohrodivka, and so on, from which they can launch drones towards Pokrovsk, hitting Ukrainian positions both in the fortified areas around the city and within the city itself from these different locations. The more they control south of Pokrovsk, the more they can strike Pokrovsk itself. But also the Ukrainians have their own positions both within the city and in the settlements around the city, from which they can launch their own drone strikes. If the Russians are able to capture some of these positions, then the siege of Pokrovsk would be less costly for their soldiers, as the Ukrainians would have less firing positions for their drone operators. And I believe this is how they have been able to capture city after city in the small sizes without really damaging the city too much, and that is through the extensive use of FPV drones. They attack the flanks, capture some of the settlements around a city, and then they launch a lot of FPV strikes within the city itself, forcing the Ukrainian soldiers to withdraw from it or face constant FPV strikes. The Russians are constantly flying over the city, which also detects the Ukrainian positions, so they're able to constantly launch these strikes. There's also precision-guided artillery strikes, and this reduces the damage on the city considerably, also increases the casualties the Ukrainians take. Therefore, the main battles will always be going forward over the settlements around cities and not the cities themselves, because the cities would end up being a drone battle between the two sides, and the further the front line moves away from the city on both flanks, the more of an advantage the Russian side will have fighting over the city. The Russians are also fighting along the Riverline here near Lysivka, where they are pushing into the eastern parts of the settlement into the central parts of Lysivka, while also pushing from the western direction, pushing into Selene. And now they've also broken through towards the northern parts of Sukhiyar along the fortified positions, cutting off the connection between Lysivka and Sukhiyar, while also storming Sukhiyar from the eastern direction, isolating Sukhiyar from Lysivka, and storming it from multiple directions. In the direction of Novolenivka, which was recently captured by the Russians a couple of weeks back, there is this footage here which shows that the Russian soldiers really just moved on foot to capture the settlement. They moved through the fortified positions, the basements, and all the way to gain a foothold within the settlement and capture the settlement. How this is possible is simply that the Russians, through the use of reconnaissance, found a gap in the Ukrainian defenses. The area itself is isolated, and there is not enough Ukrainian manpower to hold every single fortified position. We see that there's no fortified positions between Novolenivka and Toretsk further north, or through Chumansk to the east, and this allowed the Russians to move through the first lines while striking the Ukrainian positions wherever they were with their own drones, and this left some gaps. The Russians, with just a few soldiers, are able to move through the forest areas. The Ukrainians do not have enough manpower again to take care of every single soldier that the Russians sends towards their positions. So sending just 2 soldiers to capture a settlement might sound crazy in normal warfare, but the Ukraine war is anything but normal, with how in modern warfare, with the extensive use of drones, a smaller army can deal with a much larger army through the use of drones. Now we see that if both sides have extensive uses of drones and a lot of manpower, we still see these small skirmishes between soldiers where individual soldiers or just a couple of soldiers fight each other over settlements in the vast lands of Ukraine, where the majority of casualties are simply taken through the drone warfare, artillery warfare, and long-range strikes rather than direct fire between the different groups, and therefore the capture itself of settlements like Novolenivka, which are small, isolated, and not well fortified, would only need a couple of soldiers, while just next to it, Novoyelisavetivka, and to the north, Novovasilivka, saw extensive fighting for every single building, street to street, building to building, where the Ukrainians were manning a lot of these positions. So we see that there is this discrepancy between prepared position and unprepared positions, and really how much the war can change once the Russians gain full control of the Donetsk region and move into the Dnipro region or other regions where less fortified positions are present. There's no industrial zones, the geographic advantages are no longer there. We are already seeing up to 30 square kilometers, maybe even 40 square kilometers captured in a single day some of these days, while other days we hardly see any territorial changes, where the Russians simply capture 4 or 5 square kilometers. But once the fighting over the Donetsk region ends, the Russians enter the Dnipro region or enter the rear of the Kharkiv region. The territory may change drastically depending on whether the Russians would be able to establish a proper supply line through the Donetsk region into these regions prior to the Ukrainians establishing proper defensive lines within these regions. The Ukrainians are working to build defensive lines in the Dnipro region, and following that, it will likely also begin in the Kharkiv region beyond the Donetsk region. But even so, it would be less effective than what we see in the Donetsk region, considering the geographical differences. If we take a look in the Zherebets Riverline direction, the Russians have crossed over the Riverline and have gained a foothold within Ivanivka. We saw how the Russians had to fight over Terni for longer than a month to gain control of it, yet the Russians crossed the Zherebets Riverline and gained a foothold within Ivanivka within a single day of fighting. There's also reports of fighting here in the direction of Nadia across the Zherebets Riverline and further north, where the Russians are looking to expand their zone of operations here in the Oskil section of the front line, which has been largely stable for the past 2 years following the Ukrainian Kharkiv offensive. We see that the situation, although it's not very dynamic right now, it is not stable either, and it can change into any direction at any time with how dynamic the situation itself is rather than the front line. We see that the Russians continue their approaches across the Oskil Riverline and have now reached the outskirts of Zherebets following the capture of several forest patches south of Toretsk, and fighting continues within the settlement as well. Therefore, we see the continuous efforts by the Russians across the Oskil Riverline to expand their foothold and to create a proper supply line across to conduct further offensive operations towards Kupiansk from the northern direction, both in the eastern and western bank of the Oskil Riverline. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.